Before I begin this video, and though this may seem like a given to most of you, I want to push this as much as I can. Do not use anything you make as a result of this tutorial online. Do not use any of it online. And I ask also that you don't distribute it to people. You can teach them how to make it themselves, you can provide them with the resources, but do not give it to them. I guess I should preface by saying everything I have done on this channel, everything I've shown off, obviously you can't use online for relatively, hopefully obvious reasons. But given the wider appeal of sprite modification in comparison to editing input data or move properties, I want to make this distinction. If you play online with any of these ROMs, anything you make as a result of this program I'm about to demonstrate, that's cool, online, it'll cause what's known as desync. And if you're not familiar with desync, essentially it's just what's happening on your end when you're playing someone versus what's happening on their end are not the same. So perhaps on one screen you killed the person, while on the other screen they didn't die, essentially. And it should be obvious how this messes up the game and the game experience. The situations will be different, and therefore the way the game processes your inputs will differ as well. It's a whole mess, and of course you just don't want to ever put yourself in that circumstance. Put anyone in that circumstance more so. This is more of a humanitarian. It sounds absurd to call it a humanitarian issue. Just don't do it, is all. I cannot stress that enough. Do not use these ROMs online or distribute them. Again, I'd rather you teach the individual how to do so. Provide them the resources to learn, but don't give it to them. Because if they're smart enough to learn how to make such themselves, smart enough to make such themselves, and they're smart enough to be responsible with its use. Anyway, enough babbling on about this. So, the program is what I'm here to demonstrate today, to the best of my ability. That's cool, which is both a sprite editor, which is probably what most people are excited about, and an action editor, an editor for frame data, essentially. So the first thing you're going to want to do is set everything up. I'd recommend you make a folder. Inside this folder you can have essentially just all your tools. I'm going to delete this because, as a preface, the original zip file itself comes with only these things. So obviously your first step would be to start up the program. It'll give you an error, but you don't need to worry about this. You can actually just hit continue and go about your way. And then obviously you would go File, Open, and then when you see Open JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, that's presently the only one that works, I should note that you're going to need a clean, completely unmodified ROM, meaning no PAL mods, no Sprite mods, no general hacks of any kind, completely clean, completely unmodified. You can either use a split ROM, meaning what's used by FightKid2, so something like this, or a combined ROM, which is what's used by FightKid1. Essentially what you're going to want to do is open up your zip file, good god, and extract it. Preferably, I like to extract it to a folder like this, as I created here. And then you go File, Open, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and you would go, click Jojoban Modification, select Folder, and it'll load up the game. Or, well, the ROM, I should say, to be more specific. It may take a bit, but again, be patient. It's a miracle that we even have this at all. We're incredibly fortunate that someone took the time to put this all together. Anyway, actually, I'll begin by starting off with the action workshop, which I know this is probably going to be the more neglected of the two because everybody's obsessed with putting in their own little sprite modifications and such. And while that is very cool, it's important to know that this is also very, very, very cool as well. It documents the frame data for every single character in the game for every single frame. Or, well, the frame data is often referred to as actions here. So you would have action 0, which is a character's idle animation. So you can see it'll go through Jotaro's idle animation. And then on the bottom, I'd like to emphasize length of the data itself, so how many frames there are, or how many frames, yeah, I guess. The number of frames that said frame runs for, the sprite address itself, so what sprite it's using. And then there's a few other things that are kind of obfuscated as a result of my monitor being finicky and kind of funky. Tweak position, the sound that's made, and your collision. Generally, I think the main things you're going to want to touch are the number of frames and the sprite address for most things. You can go through all of the actions here. So perhaps right here you can see Jotaro's falling animation. Given the lack of hitboxes, this might be something for story mode, as actually a lot of the story mode data is defined in a similar manner to the actual in-game stuff. Your attacks, your idle animations, all that stuff. And of course, this covers every single character, from Chaka to Khan, Rubber Soul, though of course it uses the localized names of Whole Horse and Voing, Robber Soul, Iced, so on and so forth. Just keep that in mind. There's also the Advanced tab. I must be honest, as much as I hate to admit it, I don't know too much about frame data, actually, beyond the very basic stuff. So you have the option to modify these things. They're here, and that is excellent. It makes this whole process so much easier, in the sense that you no longer have to open up Xcopy, decrypt the 20 file, load up Heritage on an emulator, go to your go to the debug menu, the hit editor, and then scroll through until you find what you're looking for. In any case, this is just, it's really nice to have. It also displays the hitboxes, which again, that's not really something that, well, there is a Lua script that you can use, JoJo Hit Editor. But again, this just makes it so much easier to edit frame data. It's a wonderful thing, really. And I think it makes me sad that this is probably going to be the more neglected of the main features of this. As sad as I am to say it, because everybody loves sprite modification. That's, I guess, the big thing if you want to look at it that way. Palette Workshop as well. This is another big thing. This is like Palmod in a sense. It's just, you'd be adding the palettes yourself manually, along with the units, I believe, which is indicated by here. I actually haven't worked with this too much. I'm not much of a palette modder, if you will. But again, Jotaro's the only one that's shown here by default, but all of the colored palettes are shown A, B, C, S, and Start. And previews as well. So again, if you clicked on something and just modified it, oh wow, I didn't think that was going to be a big change, but yeah, you can see it's a gradient. It adjusts, so you could do that if you wanted. And then, of course, in order to add new palettes, you would click here for add. There's all sorts of animations, the character one, the challenger, versus, select screen, and then, of course, the character itself. Again, excellent stuff. You can load in ACT files. This really is an incredible program. As much as I love to gush on it, I guess we should move on to the big thing that everybody's here for. Sprites. So, this details every single sprite found in the object editor found in the game's debug mode, which you can access by setting your region to OX70. Hex, I mean, specifically 70 in hex, hence you include the OX. So you have Jotaro, Kakyoin, Avdol, Polnareff, everyone. You start with the characters themselves before moving on to the stands. You could see there's actually unused characters as well. Greyfly, then all the stands. Death 13 you can see here. And then a bunch of stage assets, though their palettes aren't always correctly loaded because it actually isn't correctly loaded in the base game itself. And it's just taking from that. Or it's referencing the palette used. It's difficult to explain. So I won't really touch on it. You probably won't care. Anyway. One of the major functionality features, I guess, that is quite nice, actually, is the capability to export the character sprites. I'll go, demonstrate this, perhaps, with Shadow Dio, say. So you could click Export All, and it'll provide you this format. A 512 by 512 square, and the characters positioned at 256 along the x-axis, so horizontally, and 352 along the y-axis, vertically. I'd always recommend mirroring the x-axis for reasons you'll see later. It's just, it makes importing easier, generally. And then you would select your directory. So here I guess I could go Leotard Shadow Dio, folder, original sprites, click this, select the folder, and click export. Oh. Oh. Sometimes I do worry it's going to crash. It's, again, a very early access program. I mean, frankly, I'm just fortunate. I'm grateful that we have it at all, really. But again, it may crash from time to time. You're just going to have to put up with that, because really, the alternative is having nothing, and it's definitely better to have this than to have nothing. So actually, you can see here, if I go to JoJo Modification, Leotard Shadow Dio, Original Sprites, you can see here all of the sprites have been extracted. All 844. Now, I guess since I'm here, I should briefly touch on the format for sprite injection before we actually go into sprite injection proper. I would recommend to anyone injecting sprites that you actually overlay the sprites you wish to put in on the originals, for reasons you'll see a bit later, actually. Well, I'll touch on a bit later. Anyway, back to the process of actually injecting sprites. So what you're going to want to do is select the character you wish to inject sprites onto. For this example, we'll use Young Joseph. The user sprites, or you go to the user sprites tab and you click add sprites, and it'll bring up this sprite manager here. So you'll have to make sure the lookup tag, this thing here, is set to the character you want it to be at. And you're also going to want to set your base group, which is, again, the character you want it to replace. So in this circumstance, it'd be Young Joseph. Again, I'd also recommend you flip the x-axis. Pardon me? And this would make sense, because if you remember what you did, if you followed my instructions and pasted over the exported sprites, you flip the x-axis on that. So it would only make sense. It also generally, from my experience, makes importing sprites handle more consistently, if you will. Obviously, you're going to want to import PNG files. Keep these to the same if your format is what I described, which I highly recommend it is. You flip the x-axis, and finally, your source palette. And this is really crucial to sprite injection, because if you mess this up, your sprite will not import properly. You need to make sure that your sprite is comprised only of 64 colors at most. That it follows the same regular JoJo's palette restrictions, essentially. And that, obviously, all the colors match up perfectly with that palette. Let me show you an example, actually, of what happens if they don't match up. Here's the Shadow Dio palette, extracted as an ACT file. And let's go ahead and use this sprite here of Shadow Dio and a Leotard. Now we load in this sprite, and you can see, normally this would provide us with something visually. But here you can see nothing. And the reason for this is because, despite how close it may appear to following the original palette, this doesn't follow the palette. It's not identical. The colors are not the same. They're ever so slightly different, but that minor difference makes all the difference, I suppose. That's very repetitive to say. But again, absolutely crucial. Make sure the colors are exact. They perfectly match the palette you're injecting. And better yet, I'd recommend it follow the same structure as the palette or the character you're pasting over, essentially. Because it'll, every pixel will correlate to some sort of byte value, and to very much water it down, it'll correlate to some sort of byte value. And whatever this byte value is corresponds to the palette. So, theoretically, if you're using a palette that doesn't match the same JoJo's format, it's not going to look right when you import it, unless you replace all the color palettes later on. Because again, when you use this color palette to inject the sprite, it's not going to set that character's palette to be that color. You're going to have to go in later on and edit that manually. Speaking of which, actually, this is a good thing to mention. This may not be always the same, but in the event, there are certain circumstances, to my knowledge, in which the 51 file may be modified as a result of sprite modifications. Don't quote me on this, I might be really stupid talking, take it with a grain of salt. But, in the event that is the case, you're going to need to extract that 51 file manually and edit it. You can't just paste in one of your old 51 files. Or I'm talking in terms of the old combined fight KDROMs, because that's usually what I tend to edit in. If you're thinking in terms of the FightK2 ROMs, jojoba.sim 5.4, 5, 6, and 7. Essentially, you'd have to modify yourself later on with this new version. This may not necessarily be the case, but this may not necessarily be the case. I should just leave it at that before I dig myself a greater hole. Anyway, if you want to mass import sprites, which I think is what we're going to do here. Oh. Okay, I'm back. Apologies for the delay. I ran into something that occupied my attention for a moment. Regardless, what we're going to be doing, in the event you want to mass import sprites, you can just select a source directory. So, in this example, if you couldn't already guess, I'm going to be using or importing a sprite hack of young Joseph with a different pants palette so that you can edit the two separately. I'll go into, that's cool, and pants split young Joseph. So then, of course, you have to make sure you select the source palette, young Joseph A, and then you click load sprites. It may take a bit. I just wanted to double check that I did this. I'm always very paranoid. So sprite conversion is not a perfect thing. The individual that's created this program, Judas, has managed to refine the process as much as he can, but nothing is perfect and not all edge cases can be met. There's just no way to accommodate all of that. Generally speaking, you're probably going to find the most luck with importing sprites that are of similar size and structure to the originals. Like in this case, a split pants young Joseph, which is virtually the same, barring a color palette change. So just keep that in mind. We're waiting for it to import. I mean, honestly, it's quite a miracle that it actually works so fast. The fact that it has to convert all of this into a JoJo's specific format. So I think it's frankly a miracle that it can handle all these images so quickly. Since the process of sprite conversion is a nightmare. If you're ever curious, there is a CPS3 sprite guide in the Discord server, pinned under ROM hacking, that you can look under. It's a nightmare. There were a lot of people that used to say, I'm gonna make a jacket, Dio. I'm sick and tired of waiting. And they immediately gave up when they saw the workload. Ergo, I think we should be more than thankful that someone was not only able to figure this all out, but went ahead and standardized the process generally for everyone to use. Anyway, you can see here I've gone and clicked on the lookup tag. From my experience, it doesn't really matter what you input. I've always just done 6768678, and it's worked out fine for me so far. So it'd probably work out fine for you. You just click add all new sprites. It'll add all those sprites to that sprite group. X out. And then here you have the sprites imported in your user sprites. So you can actually manually replace one by one. Click replace, go to the next sprite, click replace. But if you just want to, mass import all your sprites, you can click the batch replace button. Make sure you're selected on one of the user sprites actually, rather than the game sprites. I believe that will give you an error because it won't register there as being an object to replace currently because you're not selected on it. One other thing, actually, before I do that. In the event that you didn't follow my advice, your sprites are not likely to be perfectly lined up with young Joseph's here. And of course, that can cause issues, because right here, this little plus symbol, if you want to look at it that way, this little T, is the anchor, the basis. This is going to, like, around this area is where all your hitbox data is. Your hitbox data, your hurtbox data. So, if your sprites are skewed, like right over here, your hitbox data will be here, your character will be here, and it's just going to look jarring and terrible. Your character won't be on the ground. You'll just realize that you really screwed up. So, in order to fix that, you'd have to use these arrow keys to move your character left and right. A lot, and it'd just be a pain. So, hence, I recommend doing it the way I recommend it, the way I said it, because it just makes everything much less of a hassle later on. Anyway, click on the sprites, click batch replace, and it'll batch replace it. But you'll see some errors here, because, oh no, there's not enough free space for most of these sprites. Heritage has some free space, but not a ton. So in any case, you're going to have to start deleting some characters. I always start with Greyfly, because he's never shown in-game. And in this case, we're going to delete Theo, because from my experience, deleting Greyfly and Death 13 is what I used in the previous example, wasn't actually enough. Theo may not be enough. And herein lies part of the problem. In order to make space, you have to delete characters. It's just going to be an inevitability. Characters or stage elements. Or even game asset elements, like the title screen if you wanted. And obviously, if those things show up on one person's end when you're playing online and not on another person's end, it's going to cause issues. Because the game will process that image on one, not on the other, meaning one will be slightly ahead because it didn't have to process the image. And you can already see where I'm going with this. Don't use these online. I might say that another time. Don't use it online. Anyway, we can go back to young Joseph, click on his sprites again, and click batch replace once more. And look, there's still not enough free space. So we gotta go back and delete another character. Death 13, in this case, because he's just right there and he's what I usually do. User sprites, batch replace. The process completed successfully, and we've imported all of our sprites. So from here, we can either save it as a combined ROM or a split ROM. FightCade1, FightCade2. This is just decrypted. Don't worry about it unless you want to hack the ROM later on or something. Anyway, we'll extract it as a split ROM in this example. We'll go to here, pan-split young Joseph, split, select the folder, and it'll extract those sprites there. So now, let's say we want to load it up and test it. We'll go to pan-split young Joseph, split, we'll command A all these, and put it into this ROM here. It'll take a bit, and then we'll go to FBNeo, FightCade FBNeo, game, load game, Jobin R1. And it'll give us an error. All these errors. That means you've hopefully done something right. Well, actually, yeah. It's going to mean that, the game's ROM has been altered in some way, essentially. Which you did. So logically, that's good. If it didn't have these errors, you screwed something up somehow. Anyway, it's going to show us this. I apologize if the volume is severe. Preemptively, I'm going to turn it down to nothing. Then I'll go to young Joseph here. And we'll click him and Dio. And you'll see Dio, because I deleted his sprites, he's invisible. He's not here. But you will see that young Joseph's pants sprite is now split. I believe for most, if not all of them. Obviously, Dio's collision is still here because it operates independently of the sprite. But regardless, you can see Young Joseph's pants have been split, meaning you can PAL mod them separately. Not all of them, though. That one, I believe, is still the same. It was this person that put them together. Thank God for them, because this is a tedious nightmare to do. But they missed a few. Regardless, I appreciate it. Because I hated doing that when I did the leotard shadow deal. But that's a story for another day. And in general, I've covered the entire process of sprite injection and touched briefly upon the other two tools you can use, which I also highly recommend you do, especially the first one, the action editor. That's very, very, very cool. It makes the whole process a lot easier, and it's just really nice to have, actually. So, though a lot of people are going to neglect it, I hope that you, whoever you are watching this, doesn't. One final thing I'd like to touch on, actually, in the future, with regards to making sprites match a palette, that's going to be pretty difficult in the sense of, I guess, unless you're editing in something like Fighter Factory 3, I guess. I don't know how most of these things work. The way I've always done it is, typically I'll take a sprite I want to use, I'll take the templates, so the original sprites, I'll overlay this new one over the original, and then I'll go to File, in Photoshop, File, Export, Save for Web. I'll see the palette in like the middle left, right corner thingy. I'll go to the click, the little dashed line thing slightly above it. There's an option to load ACT palettes. I'll load in the palette. Generally, if it's something like the Pants Split Young Joseph, you'd use the original character palette. Otherwise, you'd use some sort of modified palette you made to accommodate this. And then you would export, making sure it fits within that 64 palette constraint. The nice thing about Photoshop is that it can automate processes. You can create actions, which means what you do to one thing can be repeated over and over and over again without you actually having to do it, which is very nice. It also has JavaScript support if you ever want to use that. I didn't know that for a long time. I'm not sure you really need it, but it's there, so that's cool. I guess one final thing to remind you of, in case you forgot, if ever you are to import sprites using a different palette, and then you go into using a different palette than the actual genuine regular character one, and you go in and you're like, what the heck? Why does my character look like a colored mess? That's because it's using the actual regular character's palette instead of the palette you created. So you'd actually have to open up the file in something like PalMod and edit it yourself. Arguably, I don't remember if PalMod has support for split ROMs, FightK2 ROMs, so you may have to extract it as a combined ROM or FightK1 ROM, make the changes, and then use the combine to split converter tool to put it into the proper format for use with FightK2, if you ever do that. And that's about everything. Though I will end off once again by saying, don't use this online, ever, please, God, no, don't do it. Ever. Like, don't use these ROMs online, don't distribute them to anyone. Be responsible. You have been provided with an incredible tool that can do incredible things. Don't screw up, and don't let us down.